Welcome and warning. This podcast is meant to help you think outside of the box. Today's episode is going to be discussing some triggering topics, so listener discretion is advised. All right. Welcome back to the Consume Her Consumer podcast. I am your host, Anna, aka Mystic Pixie, and today I have a brand new guest, and I am so excited. This is my friend Joel, and Joel and I went to high school together and recently reconnected via Facebook Messenger, just over chatting about some of the crazy conversations that go on there and our take on everything. And in the
Mm-hmm.
conversation, what we had learned was that both of us went down some rabbit holes and ended up finding that meditation is a freaking key to the world. So, and our whole entire spirit and everything else. So, I had invited Joel to come on the podcast because pretty much since everything else that I've been talking about, like why are we the way we are, especially as Zennials, millennials, I feel like this is like that next step, and this is such an amazing next step for us to kind of find our way and find how to regulate nervous systems and find out who we are, things like that. So I'm going to go ahead and shut up here, and I'm going to have Joel introduce himself, and then we're going to get talking. So Joel, go ahead.
Hi, Miss Anna. So thank you for having me here. And I just like to talk to people who want to talk about this kind of stuff because in the work, I'm a therapist. I worked for an agency for about 16 years. I went into private practice. And all the stuff that you get to work on with people, you don't get to talk about much to anybody else about it. So I like to talk about this stuff and bounce ideas off of people. So I thought it would be great. And I've listened to some of your podcasts, and I think you are doing a great job. Yes, I think
Thank you.
you have composed yourself very well. And I think what you're doing is fun. And I want to support people that do this type of thing. So I'll go through a very brief run through. I think the idea here was to talk about how to like spirituality just in general, and it is a broad topic. And a
Yeah.
real simple intro just for me was that I was obviously raised in this area, brought up Roman Catholic, um, and start out with that. In childhood, it's very simplistic, sort of magical understanding of spirituality. And I think there were a lot of important markers along the way. And I can, when we talk again sometime, we can perhaps go through some of those. But if I fast forward a bit, looking back on things, I think that there's more cohesion in all of the chaos when you look back, because hindsight's 2020. But when you're going through it, it can be particularly disturbing and painful. Um,
Yeah.
but one of the real jumps forward, probably my earliest exposure to meditation, to jump straight in on that, was I was in martial arts from about 10 years old. And back then, they had us do meditation at the beginning and end of every class that we had, but it was very simple. It wasn't incredibly in depth. Nobody really explained much of anything to us. And being raised in a Catholic family, prayer was a part of it, but nobody really explained that much either. So the only
Right.
thing that both of them perhaps do is make you turn inward and acknowledge that there's something important about that. But then I didn't really get any significant exposure to it until I was in my junior year of college at Penn State. And I had met a professor who was teaching some humanistic psychology classes, and he also ran a guided imagery meditation group. Now, again, I'm fast forwarding over a variety of things here because I think there were still some other interesting markers along the way, but this was my first
Right.
dive into meditation. And at first, I had no idea what the hell was supposed to be happening. And then eventually,
Same.
though, something clicked inside of my head that made sense to me. Um, and it was something akin to, because especially with guided imagery, where somebody is directing you towards, whatever the theme of that meditation might be. Um, there was a moment where I was like, what if you're just making all of this shit up in your head? But then I thought, But where's that all coming from then? It's got to be coming from something, right? So that was, for whatever reason, that might not sound important to other people, but to me, that was like a particular shift that made sense to me, is that all of this, uh, the essence of whatever is in here, whatever is you, is in here somewhere. And if you take time to look at it, you will see it. So this was my first, I think, real dive into something like meditation work. And honestly, for what it's worth, for the years that I was in that group, I mean, that's really what inspired me to become a therapist. So before I ever had the idea that I even wanted to be a therapist in the first place, I saw, I think, the incredible transformative power of meditation in terms of helping people grow. And so then
Yeah.
therapy, and I don't ramrod meditation, for what it's worth. I don't ramrod it down any client's throat. It's not like, oh, we meet the first meeting and then the next meeting is, here's how I'm going to indoctrinate you into meditation. Sometimes I'll talk to a
Right.
client for a year before we even consider meditation or we even have that conversation. So but I saw just how transformative that it was, and that's, I mean, there's a whole world to dive into with this. So I'll let you, if you have questions or thoughts or ideas of experiences that you've had. I mean, I've had quite an interesting ride of my own. So, but wherever you'd like to start, we certainly can. That's a bit of my intro into it, though.
Yeah, no, I love it. Well, I'll kind of give you my little background to what happened because it's actually pretty recent. And it's not even just the like you said, the spirituality of it too. It was huge for me because I had learned about the universal laws, I think probably about 2 years ago now, and I was learning about the law of attraction and attracting money and things like that, and I was able to make that happen, but then I lost it, and I was like, "What the heck happened?" Like, but I found that I was being toxically positive, and I'm really kinda like, this was still a way jump forward, but to kinda go back, with my job that I had, I worked for I had done 15 years of public service between local, state, and federal government jobs. And the last job I had 2 mental breakdowns, like big ones, like one, like a whole suicidal ideation, and it was 2 of them within a month, or I'm sorry, 7 months, and my husband was like, "Yanni, you gotta quit. You cannot go through life like this." He was like, "You are dead inside." And I couldn't
Yeah,
see it because all I kept thinking is, "You have to go, go, go." And for
yeah.
me, I was like, "Okay, what the hell happened? Like, why do I feel this way? Why do I think that this is the only way?" And I ended up leaving that job. And so then the whole spirituality thing kind of started unfolding for me. And I had to find, because while we grew up in a really heavy Roman Catholic
Mm-hmm.
town, I'll say, or our whole area, or even, it was just, there were only like very basic religions around us. I never resonated with any of them. And then I found that I was like, there has to be something. And I knew that, like, for me, there was some sort of higher being or something that I was like, I have to like figure this out. And I ended up just sitting one day and I was like, why the heck can't I ever shut my mind off? And somebody was like,
Yeah.
try meditation. Well, again,
Yep.
I was
Yeah.
like I had no idea what the hell I was supposed to do. And like the whole time my brain's just like flooding with stuff. And I realized my whole entire body was suffering. I had like, from like, it was like my whole personality and my whole being was nothing but a trauma response. And I was
Mm-hmm.
like, no, I need to figure this out. And that's kind of where I started learning. I started diving into it. I started reading on spirituality. And then, like, I started getting guided meditations then. Cause I was like, okay, let's go to people
Mm-hmm.
that know what the heck they're doing and I'll listen and see. And for a while, it did take a while for those like flooding thoughts and, the gloom and doom to kind of go away. I'm still combating it. But I got to the point where I'm like, okay, I can actually quiet my mind now. And I realized, like, sometimes stepping away for 10 minutes and just breathing, taking those
Mm-hmm.
deep breaths, clearing your brain, I can feel like I'm a whole new person again and come back and interact with people, where before I would like leave and like I would be replaying conversations in my head. I was looping really bad and I just couldn't get the spiral to stop, if that makes sense. I know as a therapist, you probably hear that
Mm-hmm.
pretty often.
No, I do. And what's interesting about all of this, and going back to I don't. There was a time where my opinion of this. Well, this is like what spiritual development is all about, and and this is inside. How would I say this? When I look at things now in terms of like this, the place that religion holds is sadly, even though this. I mean, I went to Catholic school, and yet I would say throughout my history, I've never really met anybody who could explain various takes or perspectives on the Bible that are actually useful. I've found people since that can. I think that people either love him or hate him, but I'm a big fan of Dr. Jordan Peterson, and he does a whole series with a panel of experts where they pick apart Exodus, the Gospels, and all of these things, and they take a very, very in-depth approach of how they look at it beyond the surface level. And I could honestly say, throughout my Catholic schooling, uh, there's good and bad priests. How much time do you get to spend with any of them to pick their brain about any of it? You really don't. So you get that
Right.
period of time in mass, if you attend, to be taught about what any of this is, and it's really a McDonald's version. Sorry to say that, but it's sort of like this brief snippet of understanding, which is very
Yeah.
limited. And but to meet with anybody that can give you a deeper cut into why any of this is relevant or what it means or how it makes sense, hard to find. So I think it's easy for many people. That's why currently I don't necessarily think religion is bad. I think it is integral, but I think why do people find their way separating from it is because there's nothing that keeps it connected to it in a meaningful way. And so I think part of the era that I grew up in and that you grew up in was it's hard to say the timing of things. Like in my mind, like in the 1960s, Eastern influences hit the United States shores, and we see a lot of social changes that happen at that time, psychedelics happening at that time, and you see meditation
Yep.
hitting the scene at that time. Now, why did it take until the 1980s, 90s, or late 90s for it to hit some of us? I don't fully know. And I got hit by it more when I got into college because I happened to serendipitously be attending, class there, psych class where, this teacher was running a meditation group, and so getting away from, again, religion that you might not understand because there's no better interpretation that is given to you to connect to it in a deeper way, but at the same time, when I found meditation at that time and I finally understood it, I felt a deeper connection to something. And even with that, the guided meditation was very good. And if I describe that a little bit, it was basically a public group. Anybody could go. It was free. And the professor at the time was into what he called, I mean, what is known as, but you don't hear of very often, it's called transpersonal psychology. You won't find it in a textbook anywhere.
Okay.
But there's a profound
Interesting.
number of individuals that yeah, you won't find it in a textbook anywhere. But I mean, there's some really tremendous people like Stan Grof and Abraham Maslow, who were the founders of transpersonal psychology, and the different movements of psychology always sought to include something more. It went from a Freudian unconscious focus to a behavioristic focus that might not even consider that the mind exists at all, to a humanistic movement. And this is what Abraham Maslow was looking at, that there were heights of human potential beyond our most basic drives. And even he was stumbling into Eastern influence because he used the term peak experiences. Well, you get into meditation, you will understand a peak experience. So he was, in my opinion, he was definitely borrowing from Eastern culture. But then, even when they had developed humanistic psychology as a movement, they also felt like there was still something more that they're not including. And this is what, in fact, Stan Grof is he's a psychiatrist originally from Czechoslovakia, and he had a very interesting story. I'll deviate to that for just a second. His mother, I believe, was Catholic. His father was a pagan, and when they went to get married, the church wouldn't allow it because he was a pagan. And then one of the grandparents gave a sizable donation to the church, which allowed them to then marry. So that upset them quite a bit,
Interesting.
and they decided to raise their sons with no religion whatsoever. And so Stan Groff gets he makes his way through psychiatry. He moves to the United States, and then somewhere in his career, he's one of the first, if not the first, to be given by I don't know if it was pretty sure it was like a drug rep company that provided him with LSD 25, and this was he agreed to take this under the supervision of his own mentor, and had experiences that he said it changed and shifted his whole take on psychiatry to this day. And he had very spiritual experiences that he said couldn't have been explained. He said, I saw things I didn't even know existed, and they are real. He said,
Interesting.
I left my body. And so this wasn't a whole made up experience in his head as much as um, I would say there's lots of different ways to get there. When you use a chemical like LSD, it pushes the envelope on our kind of chemical homeostasis. It sort of pushes the comfort zone of what we're used to and throws you into an experience. I think this can happen in lots of ways, and meditation is just one of them. But he did it initially through psychedelics, and this changed. So he went from being raised almost atheist to 180-degree turn. So he became to, I'm not saying he became a born again Christian or anything, but he came to believe in the essence of spirit. And so this is fascinating because
Right.
this is was one of the like really progressive movements of psychology, but you will almost never find it in a psych textbook anywhere, which I think is a travesty. And and so another person that I find
And
very
almost probably
profound, like,
purposeful.
oh yeah, I think so. I would think so because I think it's just a
Yeah, I
travesty.
think they bury that stuff.
Yeah, no, I would agree. And person who takes it a step further that I've just found absolutely fascinating in about 2006 or 7, and this was a really strange serendipitous experience. I kept going into Barnes and Noble, and I'd always go to this one section where these were the section of books I really like on growth and development and spirituality. And I kept seeing this one book, and I'd look at it and stare it down, and I didn't buy it. I don't know why I didn't buy it. And I'd pick it up, I'd look at it, set it back down, and but then eventually I started looking through it. I was like, this is some fascinating stuff. And I put it back on the shelf. And finally I bought the damn thing. And it was Ken Wilber's A Brief History of Everything. And I was like, when I finally read this thing, my head clicked. This was like, if there were a number of different like switch points in your life where something shifted, this was, one of them for sure. And the interesting thing about Ken Wilber is he seeks to put like this integral map of, well, where does everything fit together, right? And I've not seen. I listen to a lot of people talk, and they all to me sound like they're running in their own lane. He was the only person that in my mind was putting together a system of where do all of these lanes come together. And to me, he's put together a brilliant map. It doesn't mean I agree with him all the time on everything, but this was fascinating. I have not seen anybody bring this kind of a comprehensive way of understanding, like, where do we fit in all of this. And a beautiful thing about it to me was that he includes everything. It's not like, well, let's just include spirit and forget everything else, which is what a lot of pioneers do. They find the holy grail of what they find important, and they think that's everything. And he's saying, well, let's look at, in psychology, let's look at what the psychoanalysts discovered. Let's look at what the cognitive behaviorists discovered, and let's look at what everybody contributed and brought to the table. And then let's try to sort it out and see where it all fits together. I've never
I
seen
love I
anybody
just
do
wrote that
that.
down.
And he's got so many different books, and yet every book that he's written, he dives into, it's all connected. He'll connect it to his whole framework, but he'll dive into a section and then just blow that section up. And so that really struck me. And a funny, very synchronistic thing that happened is I have a cousin who's also a psychologist who's probably 20, 30, well, at least 30 years older than me, lives in a different state. We don't get to talk or see each other that much. And one particular year, we were at a family reunion together, and sure as shit, we were both reading the same book at the same time by Ken Wilber. And this is not like a top 10 book.
No
I would
way.
not be remiss to say that I would imagine nobody and I'm not patting myself on the back. A lot of this stuff is serendipity, but I would almost guarantee probably most people that I've ever worked with or in my profession probably don't even know who Ken Wilber is. This is not somebody who's on, a top 10 reader list for psychologists or counselors. But he is, I would say, anybody in my field, and he writes it for layman's people. It can get a little academic how he talks, but at the same time, like once you get it, it's like, oh wow, this is like kind of where everything sort of fits. So he brought together, I mean, so bringing spirituality into it, and so he doesn't leave out like, so what is the wisdom that we have gained from like pre-modern times, and rather than throw all of that out because the arrogant stance that, oh, we're in this modern world and we know better than that, weren't we so silly before, he brings all of that to the table and treats it as if it was a scientific inquiry into spiritual practices. So so this to me, strengthened and emphasized, you're on the right path with this. And there's more to the story still. I'll kind of hold that for another time, but like, you know, I think
Yeah,
religion has a place in all of this. But
I
this
do
was
too.
intriguing to me. So I couldn't tell the story without including his name in this because I think he's been kind of a paramount way of trying to understand where some of these things sort of fit together. So I'll pause and take a breath there, but I do want to mention, like when you said about like the mind spinning and diving into meditation, this is one of those things that why should we include the wisdom of say pre-modern times? Well, when you look at something, and in the time we were raised, you stayed inside the box of Christianity. You did not deviate from that. And what's
Right.
unique about that to me is that the moment that I did deviate from that, it's really interesting how much you can learn about other cultures. And when you look at other cultures and see, and I'm
Yes.
not debating like is Christianity right or wrong compared to this one or that one, but I very much believe everybody has something to say. And that's another actual idea of Ken Wilber's is he said, I don't believe that any mind is capable of 100% error. And I don't believe that either. So if you consider that there's no mind can be 100% in error, then that means that the perspectives around the world have to share something of value. And in my mind, I think that they all landed on something that overlaps with one another and is connected to the same thing. Um, One of the people that Ken Wilber has referenced different times, and I try to pay attention to that. Who's he been, inspired by and learning from? And there's an author named Houston Smith, and he was an interesting guy too. So this is a guy who was his parents were from somewhere in Middle America, Christian background. They moved to China to teach Christianity there. So he grew up his whole life in China, in, oh gosh, I couldn't tell you what decade, but probably somewhere in the 50s or something, 40s, 50s, somewhere in there. Eventually comes back to the United States, gets his college degree, but basically the whole of his career as a professor, he had the opportunity to study world religions. And this is fascinating to me. So these are one of these integral thinkers that like Ken Wilber has emphasized at different points in his own writing. And so he has a book. He has a lot of different books, Houston Smith, but one that I really wanted to tackle was a book of his called Tales of Wonder, which is his biography. I wanted to know more about him. And so in this wonderful book, but somewhere around the end of it, he mentioned somebody asked him, because at different points in time, so he studied, you name it, he studied it. But anytime he went somewhere and studied a religion, he took on the practice of it as if it was his own. So he said, if you saw me on any given day, you'd have probably thought I was somebody of the Islamic faith. He's like, I tried everything. And so what's interesting to me though is that as he kind of reflects over all of it, somebody asked him like something to the effect of, you know, having practiced all of these different things, do you feel like it's actually weakened your faith in Christianity? And he said, no, it's actually strengthened my faith in Christianity because all of these different practices, which is my feeling, is that every culture has something that they stumbled upon that connects them to the divine. They understand it in their own
Yes.
way, but through whatever practice they found, which I also think is inevitable. If you go inward and you have the beauty of different cultures is they've also constructed a set of rules around that, right? So you don't just go into your mind and whatever happens happens. Is that there's a set of rules they all have of the ritual or the practice that you repeat that obtains a certain result. And so that's fascinating to me. And I thought this was an interesting statement that he made. So somebody who was so uh, educated and experienced in world religion to say that, I thought that was fascinating. And to me, it kind of strengthened my same idea, was that all cultures and religions have tapped into some aspect of the same thing. They built a practice around that, or through their practice they found it, and this is why these things exist. So for example, and this is something that I think is very fascinating part of Buddhism, um, and some even refer to Buddhism as like Buddhist psychology. They look at it as a psychological system that existed 2,500 years ago rather than solely as a religion. And I think there's a quote of the Dalai Lama that says, Buddhism is not a religion, it's a science of the mind. And I love that, because so this has been around for
Yeah.
2,500 years that predates modern psychology. And that's one of the things that I think was interesting about mindfulness practice. So somewhere around, about the same time, somewhere in 2006 or so, I was looking to do meditation, not just at the group, but when I was at home. Like, what should I be doing when I'm not in this group? And the teacher didn't really emphasize anything of use. So I stumbled upon the work of Dr. Jack Kornfield, who is a psychologist and an ordained Buddhist monk. I had a great opportunity to do a weekend retreat with him in New York City back in 2010, with a
Hmm.
woman named Tara Brock. Tara Brock's another psychologist and meditation teacher who's very good friends with Dr. Cornfield. So my wife and I had a chance to go up there and spend the weekend doing a retreat there with Dr. Cornfield. But he very much looks at it. In fact, the name of the seminar that we went to, it was for continuing education credits. It was called The Gifts of Western and Eastern Psychology. So he literally, the terms that he used for Buddhism is Eastern or Buddhist psychology. So they look at this system that incorporated a spiritual practice like meditation. And so, one of the things that I think is very profound of that is that if you look at, say, in Buddhism, so many cultures have their code of ethics. Like, so Christianity has the Ten Commandments, and Buddhism has the Eightfold Path, and variety of other systems have their own commandments or ethics that they keep. And but the backbone of the Eightfold Path are sort of three things that I think they make a hell of a lot of sense. So, and everything on the Eightfold Path fits into one of these three categories. Now, why not nine? I don't know. Why not a ninefold path? I do not know. It would fit mathematically better, but there's sort of three overarching principles. And the
Yeah.
first one is the importance of ethical conduct. So why do you need a code of ethics? Because if you go against, a moral element to life, you will suffer, right? And I think if you look at even the Ten Commandments, you can like or dislike Christianity, but yet there is nothing in those Ten Commandments that tell you should do something wrong against humanity. There is nothing in there, and every culture has something like that, that you have to act in a certain way or it'll bring suffering. And so that's the first one. The second one, which is also fascinating to me, and there are, I'm not using the old language terms for each of these categories. They have them. I don't know. I can't remember them off the cuff. But the second set of principles for this was the importance of mental discipline, and that struck me really hard because, like, we discipline ourselves in all of these different ways. Why wouldn't we also need to discipline the mind? Right, that when you go in there, that there is a set of ways that you engage. So when you sit in meditation, you don't just sit there and think a lot. There are certain things that you are doing, and so they emphasize this through this, the importance or the value of mental discipline. And again, to me, fascinating. And the third one is the importance of the development of wisdom. And so these three things to me, again, uh, they're fascinating because they come from something from 2,500 years ago, that the whole backbone of their code of ethics, or their eightfold path, that was a way to eliminate suffering, or learn how to work with some of the inevitable suffering, is based on these ideas, right? So you can't just go out in the world and do whatever you want, which is a big problem that we're seeing out in the world right now. Everybody thinks that they can
Absolutely.
narcissistically just have their own truth, and that if they go out there, but that runs neck
Yes.
and neck with something else. What if your truth runs into somebody else's truth? What do we do now? Well, until you have a better integrated way of understanding this, is like that becomes a paradox. Somebody else's truth runs into this person's truth, and now we don't know what to do. So what do we do? We don't
Right.
do anything, I guess. So you can't take action because it'll step on someone's toes. So this is important, right?
Right.
Is that we have to have this code of conduct. We can't just go out and do whatever the heck we want, right? And the other thing, mental discipline, so that there is a way of going about how we, so we have this consciousness that we perceive the world through, right? This is the window through how we perceive the outside world, and whatever inner experiences are wrapped up in that. And so and we'll get into the meditation part. So why is meditation important? Is because, in my mind, that if you think about where any of these problems lie, they lie within the self. And when you meditate, what are you
Yes.
symbolically doing? You're retreating and going back into the self where all of these things reside. And meditation is a practice of learning how to be with these things as they arise in the space of your own awareness. And so this isn't some unknowable mystical thing that again can't be known. This, by virtue of this whole idea of mental discipline, is why is there a set of rules, and what happens when you do this thing. And and so something that I also emphasize to clients is that there's also an element of this, that if you don't tag this last part into it, you're missing something. And that's why this idea of the development of wisdom as a result of this is important, because another name for mindfulness is insight meditation. And another name still is vipassana, which basically means the same thing. Is that so when I do this thing, when I go inward, and I come myself, I think of it this way. There's two things that are going on in meditation for sure. You are learning how to embody experience that's arising, which to me is like a compassion element. And you are also learning to gain, or the drive is to gain insight from the experience that you've had. So and many people who take on the idea of, well, let's be in the present moment. Being present is a lot of things, but there's some things that in my mind it is definitely not. It is not living on impulse. It is not just doing whatever you
Right.
feel. And it is not an absolute disregard to the past either, as much as it's learning to be present with all of these things as they arise in the now. And um, so far
Yes.
as what some people will do, and I had a lovely lady. I ran this is something I did for the agency I worked for. I ran a mindfulness group for 4 years during COVID and on, and it was all telehealth and video. And it was interesting because our agency had never really done groups, and nobody wanted to. And I was like, man, this is just a better way to teach meditation, is to have people connected to other people who are also doing it. So I ran the group for 4 years until I eventually left and went into private practice. But an important sort of caveat to this was that, through this experience of meditation, there was this one lady who, um, I'm not endorsing this, but it is a great app. There's an app called Insight Timer, and there's a lot of neat benefits to it. It's mostly free. Yeah, you can use it without paying a dime. But she decided to take a course on there. It's like, oh, that's great. Like, tell the group about what you learned from this 10-week course that you did with Tara Brock. And she said, oh, well, it was very nice. And I said, well, what was nice about it? And she's like, it was
Yeah.
nice. I said, you don't remember anything, do you? And she's like, no, I don't. And I said, well, thank you for being honest, but maybe you ought to do it again, because part of meditation is not just, it's not an escape from the world. It's not just getting on the ride
Right.
and enjoying it while you're on it, but then forgetting everything that happened when you come off. Is that if you don't gain insight about what you just saw, it's worth nothing. So there's sort of two things that Ken Wilber says that go hand in hand with us. And he says, enlightenment leaves things exactly as it found it. So I always imagine it's like if you went up in a helicopter and you saw the ground from way up high and you could see so much more, well, eventually you come right back down. And if you don't consciously take what you gained from that and inject it or integrate it into what you're doing, then it's exactly as he said. You had this experience of enlightenment, but whatever you saw, whatever you remember from that experience, if you don't do something with it, nothing will happen at all. And to follow up on that, he says
Right.
the greatest sin we can commit is to have an insight about something and then do nothing about it. So so all of these experiences, in my mind, they're in there to be had if you take the time to bring more awareness to what's there. And I do see it as a mystical thing, but there's nothing mysterious about it. It really is a function of, if you take time to do this, then you will see what's there. And if you don't do it, you won't. And that's just how it goes. So as you get, so kind of wrapping this idea up, is that from, the embodiment of experiences that can come from meditation, that's a very healing element to it, learning to be inside yourself and with your experiences, without judgment, and allowing yourself to sensationally feel what's arising and see what's there. But then the next very relevant part is that, well, whatever came, we have to seek to know and understand it. Consciousness is seeking to know. And so far as that part of us goes, is that whatever happened, we need to take that with our conscious mind and follow up on it. We have to do something with it. So those kind of two elements of it, is this embodiment of experience as well as developing insight and integrating that into our experiences. So that's a lot of thoughts and ideas around this topic of meditation, but these are some really important things to me, and that's why ultimately I find it very fascinating. And I do think everybody should be doing it. And how it
Right.
connects then sometimes, how it connects, I think, to religious experiences, that um, this is a first person direct experience of spirit in my mind, like to me. And um, I will say there is a really decent book that Ken Wilber put out. It's an audio book, but it's called The 3-2-1 of God. And what's fascinating is that he looks at it through a first person lens, a second person lens, and a third person lens. So he looks at spiritual experiences through each of those perspectives. And each of those lenses bear different characteristics. And so for me, beyond, other than prayer, in Christianity and Catholicism specifically, that whole first person experience of the divine and of spirit was very under discussed. It was under taught, and it was almost overlooked. And I think the problem that happens instead is it shifts over into, and again, nothing against priests, but the idea that there's somebody up there that knows better than you, telling you what to do, but not showing you how to do anything. And this was another thing that
Right.
I found fascinating about like mindfulness, was that in their culture, it was very crucial for the teacher to teach you how to meditate, so that you were connecting to
Yes.
your own experience and being able to report back and know what that was. And I just saw that as something that was, looking back over all of this, is something fundamentally missing from my early spiritual upbringing.
Right. And I think it's so interesting because as you were talking, the one thing that kept coming up to me was, and we're never going to be done learning. That's like the other thing that I'm like, it is, you know, you have this big breakthrough. I'm not done. None of us are done. It's going to, we're going to continue to be enlightened. And that's the most beautiful part of it for me, is like knowing that, oh
Hmm.
my gosh, like I'm just going to continue to have like these breakthroughs.
It's well,
And
and
so
God,
another thing, oh, go ahead.
go ahead. No, 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 go ahead.
I was just going to note, you said something else about having to feel it. And I had an experience literally 2 days ago because I got rejected from two major jobs that I was like really hoping I would get. And I was not selected. And you know, I had my moment. I cried and stuff. And I was starting to get like the fight or flight coming out, my shoulders, my
Hmm.
neck. Like, and I sat down and I was like, you have to let this ride. You have to feel it. It's okay. This doesn't define you. This is a moment. You got to let it go. And I kept breathing, and I had to kept just remind myself, like, listen, this doesn't make you unworthy and made you not suitable for those positions, and that's
Hmm.
okay. Something better's on its way. And you know, I woke up the next day after kind of talking myself through it, and it was like, holy crap, like I feel better today. Had an interview, knocked it out of the park. Like I'm going to be getting a second interview. Not saying that that was like what came from that, but I'm just, you know, your mindset is so powerful. And it's really cool now to kind of
Hmm.
see that having to feel those feelings, it's rotten sometimes. It doesn't feel good, but if you push them into the back and you make excuses, that's not doing anything for you. It's going to come up later and
Hmm.
you're going to have to shed it later. So that's what I'm trying to get into, that present moment, like you said, and feel it, let it be. It's okay, because not every day is going to feel perfect. It's just not.
Hmm. No, and I mean this, and why this to me meditation is also so important is because I think like, why does it work? It's not because somebody dreamed this up. It's because somebody realized that these are embedded features of who we are as human beings, and so it's a natural thing that we should be doing. And it's a way to address and govern what goes on in our interior development. So, for example, even emotions, like if so, this is why in my mind something like meditation can be useful in the field of counseling and social work because, like, it works on so many different levels. And it should, because if something is so inherently natural to our being, then it should actually resonate along different layers. It can be something that helps provide psychological improvement, but it's also something that's connected to the very spirit of our being. So it's like feeding everything. You know, it's feeding us on all of these different levels. So going back just to
Right.
emotions, honest to God, I could probably, aside from meditation, and trying to help people to like integrate all of these different aspects of self into the work that they're doing therapeutically. um, One of the, I think, really most interesting, and I want to hear your thoughts on this because we grew up in the same era. One of the most confusing
Yep.
things I think of the human experience is emotions. They are the most
Yes.
confusing thing. And in your lifetime, maybe aside from like meditation, was there anybody that you knew personally that really taught you how to manage, address, handle, understand your emotions very well?
No, and I say this all the time because I'm like, why are we not teaching this in schools? It would be so important. To me, I feel like if we are teaching kids how to regulate their emotions, how to tap, how to breathe, I do all kinds of different things. Even I have this little breathing whistle that I wear on a necklace of like when I'm feeling anxious, I it slows the breath, it helps expand the lungs and calm that nervous system. But we're teaching them to numb and shut up. And then I'm wondering, like, you know, and
I
then
know.
it leads me to like, this is why so many of our friends ended up addicted to drugs. Like I had an
Mm-hmm.
obesity problem. I was addicted to shopping. You know, and I know a lot of people are. We try to buy this identity rather than be ourselves. And I think
Yes.
that
Yeah.
that really comes from not being able to regulate our emotions. That's
Mm-hmm.
my take. I'd like to hear what you think.
I agree with it wholeheartedly. And again, it's not just what happened in the damn 80s. It is also like there's sorry I make a lot of references, but the way my mind works is I always like link to
Oh, I love
something
it.
that makes me remember something else. So and then I'm familiar with there's a monk named Pema Chodron, and I'm not super familiar with her, but she put together a series that was called something like anger, don't take the bait, or don't take the hook, or don't bite the hook, something like that. But I remember in the series
Okay.
she's going, and this to me is just symbolic. Like, think about this, is like she's going over, and so here she is, a monk of her own right, and she is going over the manuscripts or transcripts of like a 4th century sage named Shanti Deva, who's talking about emotions, specifically anger. And I'm thinking, like, holy hell, like 1600 years later, we're still confused about emotions, and they were confused about them back then and
Right.
talking about them and trying to navigate them. So this is not something small. And but I do think that in our times, people have made significant headway with it. But again, it's just one of those
Yeah.
things that hasn't like broken through to mainstream, maybe education, or into the family home. And another author and psychologist, I believe he's a psychologist, is Daniel Goleman. He wrote a book called Emotional Intelligence, and I think it's profoundly
Yes.
fascinating. And with the interesting backstory of this, he does. I don't even think he shares this in his book, and I do not remember where I heard this. But at the time that he was, I think, graduating from his doctoral program in psych, I want to say somebody mentioned that even at that time they really weren't honing in on emotions, even in the field of psychology, very much. I don't remember what the hard focus was, but it wasn't emotions. But what was very interesting is, I want to say he was friends with the spiritual teacher Ram Dass, and I don't remember Ram Dass's actual name, but he was a Harvard professor. And so all around the same time, they get involved in meditation. And from that, it shifted his whole perspective against all of his colleagues, about our whole inner experience and how that can be navigated and how it can be held and how it can be known. And then he wrote this book, Emotional Intelligence. And I think that link is so profound because, like, you know,
It is.
this wasn't somewhere separately from a different side of the world that he just dreamt this up. Like, he entered through the doorway of meditation. He came back with interesting perspectives on the whole matter. And then it shifted his work, and he wrote books about it, this ability to develop emotional intelligence. And I know probably in the last 5 or 7 years that that's been more of a buzzword, emotional
Yes.
intelligence. And interestingly enough, I know, I mean, growing up, even in our small town, I knew some people that were absolutely brilliant people, really high IQs, I'm sure. Fascinating. And they couldn't get themselves out of their parents' basements as an adult to go live out in the world,
Yeah.
you know? So there's something,
Yeah.
IQ's not everything. And actually, even in the book, he talks about, maybe only 20% of a person's success has anything to do with their actual IQ. And the rest seems to be more
Yeah.
about how they navigate the stuff of life. And so, uh, more recently, you see things like emotional intelligence is a greater indicator of success in life than actual IQ is, cognitive intelligence. It's fascinating stuff, right? Because if there's anything that is the most
Oh
confusing
my gosh.
topic to address and try to figure out is emotions. And if there was some scaffolding to
Right.
that, which again, I think that he's done some great work in kind of putting that into motion. I mean, that would be really beneficial for more people. Is just like what, and I want to say kind of one more thing on this topic that sort of, again, it's all connected, it's all integrated. I did a training some years ago with Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, who's like a pioneer in the field of trauma. I mean, and he's a funny guy. He's just a maverick. He's a think outside the box kind of guy, and I really enjoy him. But he wrote books like The Body Keeps the Score. And he was actually one of the psychologists who was on the panel of people that put together the diagnosis of PTSD. And so I've had a couple trainings that I've been in with him, and one of the things he said that, again, it was one of those things that strike a chord and really kind of make the light bulb go off in your head. But he said, we regulate ourselves through three things. And it was this. He said, breathing, movement, and touch. And I thought, That's fascinating because meditation itself,
It's so fascinating.
um, can do. Is definitely covered the breath part of it. There are active meditations, things like Tai Chi and yoga, where their movement is involved in it, right? And why does physical exercise? I mean, there's studies that show that like physical activity is, when done in different studies, is more effective than antidepressants, right? And so it's this
Yep.
reminder and call that there's a body and a movement component to all of this that is yet to be fully understood. And then touch, and that's a whole other topic itself, just the power of touch. But the fact that he said this
Yeah.
to me was really, it's embedded and integrated in this whole idea, right? That these are basic fundamental aspects of the human being and maybe of life, is that these basic things. um, there was an interesting story he told about this young little boy who traumatized, and he was at this hospital he was working at, and this doctor was coming down the hallway. So this kid wouldn't talk and he wouldn't engage with people. And it was so funny. The doctor coming down the hallway did this very simple thing. He kicked the ball over to this little boy, and the boy kicked it back. And I mean, here's a kid who was not engaging. And so it's these really
Right.
simple, he said, but just by that simple act, he reconnected him to this, the variety of different ways that whatever the seen and unseen aspects of how we connect as human beings. But he, from the bottom up, he helped kind of reignite this, like jumpstart this system inside of him that had been paralyzed, frozen solid from trauma. And it was something as simple as just kicking this little ball to him, movement and engagement. And that's fascinating because that means, that this is a pathway how we
Yep.
help to moderate and regulate ourselves. And one of the things he said further that I thought was fascinating, there was a 9-month course that we had to do for trauma studies. And one of the things he said, so there's all these different people teaching all these different things about their take on trauma. And he said, if the one thing you can do is help your client to emotionally regulate themselves, that is the most important thing you can achieve with them. And I thought that's fascinating because all these different systems are trying to do all these different things. And yet, one of the most basic is if they can regulate their own emotions, that's the most important thing you can do. So, emotions are a really
Absolutely.
important and confusing topic. And I think that it needs a lot more light shown on it. And meditation to me is a very, very powerful tool to get back in touch with these things. So, I can pause
Absolutely. I couldn't
my
agree
chatty
more.
mouth there.
So yeah, and what I will kind of cut it off here. And what I was gonna, I mean, I could listen to you talk all day. I think that we could honestly span a million topics from this, and we will. We're gonna get back together and do another episode as soon as we can. Then, but what
Yep.
I wanted to say is maybe next time you
Yes.
touched on some things, and with the direction I've had the podcast right now is kind of like how we led up to where we are now, and we touched on
Yeah.
that. But I think it's really interesting if we tie in some media ties with this and kind of see like because I feel like a lot of that shaped it. Like for instance, like you were just talking about the emotions, and if you think about it, so many people rage out with anger and they're punching things and
Mhm.
and we're
Mhm.
never like really I saw a thing once that said, anger is really a mask for sadness and rejection and things like that. And I just think that we could definitely span onto something like that next time if you're interested then
Yeah, no,
or
and I think
anything. I'm
you're
cool
doing
with
a
it, but
I think you're doing a great job as far as like connecting this to like the social element of things. And actually this,
yeah.
uh, we can talk about this when I would like to talk. I'd love to talk again next, again, because I think this is what you're doing is fascinating, and I think there's a lot of interesting topics here. But with the ties that you've made to culture and society, I think that this is where like Ken Wilber's integral model ties these things in tremendously. So, and I'll talk more about that when we talk again next time. But that's just, I'll leave it on this:
Yeah.
is that there's such an important, um, uh, frame for both our individual experience as well as how that shows up in the social world. And that's not two separate things, as sort of one holistic connected thing. And so when you're bringing that up, I mean, it's absolutely relevant because these are sort of like individual interpretations and reported experience. But yeah, so how has culture shaped some of these things, and what does that look like, and what are the ramifications of that?
Yep.
Yeah, so I'd be, yes,
Oh, that's
happy to talk
amazing.
with you about some of those things.
Well, this is great. This was a great first time for us to connect, especially since it's been so long. So I
I
will let
know.
you go because I know you got to pick up your kiddos. I got to get my kiddos.
Yep.
So
Yep.
it was awesome. So thank you so much for being a guest. I am so
You're
appreciative.
welcome. This was fun, my dear.
All
So
right.
thank you very much. It's good to see you.
You too.